In 2023, the northern part of the Kharkiv region was one of the few Ukrainian eastern parts that saw no active combat. After the Russians retreated in fall 2022 as a result of the Ukrainian Kharkiv Counteroffensive, the topic of one of our past videos, both sides used the northern border mostly to keep the troops rotated out of active combat for replenishment. However, the Russian desire to continue advancing in the most reinforced part of Ukraine, Donbas, in 2024 transformed into a more ambitious idea: to launch an additional attack in a place other than the area of the most recent successes, the Donetsk region, for the sake of diversion. This place is the northern part of the Kharkiv region. For the attack at the beginning of 2024, Russians formed a new grouping of forces north, estimated to be around 50,000 men, out of which around 35,000 will be used in the operation planned by grouping commander Colonel General Alexander Lapin. These forces will face the Ukrainian operational tactical grouping Kharkiv, which will on average number only around 15 to 20,000 men. As of May 10, 2022, the two key sectors of the Ukrainian border where Russian forces are expected to advance are defended by the 415th Separate Rifle Battalion from the 23rd Mechanized Brigade and 172nd Battalion from the 120th Territorial Defense Brigade and elements of the Steel Border Guard Brigade. The apparent lack of forces, particularly in the Vovchansk area, is compounded by confusing and largely ineffective command and control structure, as the two aforementioned rifle battalions are subordinated to but not originally part of the 125th Territorial Defense Brigade, which remains in the rear with its own battalions. Elements of the 113th TDF Brigade are stationed to the west, but are separated by a large water reservoir. Rivers are expected to play a significant role in the new invasion, as they divide Ukrainian defenses into isolated sectors, while simultaneously protecting the flanks of the Russian forces. Near Vovchansk, the river forms a natural defensive barrier, though it still allows the northern part of the city to be easily cut off by strikes on key bridges. Fortunately for Ukrainians, on May 9th, certain sections of the border, as well as command elements, were reinforced with operatives from the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, notably from elite Kraken Regiment and the special HIMARS unit. In reserves, the grouping has the recently battle-worn 42nd Mechanized Brigade, the foreign volunteer Ishkevian Battalion, the 15th Reconnaissance Artillery Brigade, the 2nd Detachment of the Omega Special Purpose Center, along with its skilled Peaky Blinders drone unit. In addition to being composed of an assortment of different small units, the grouping's hands are particularly tied when it comes to artillery strikes. The 15th Reconnaissance Artillery Brigade, equipped with HIMARS systems and a wide array of reconnaissance drones, can clearly identify concentrations of Russian forces behind the border, but is prohibited from striking targets on Russian soil with American-provided missiles, without official authorization from the White House. Despite the long period since the area was last under a direct attack, Ukrainian forces along the border still rely on weak fortifications, consisting mainly of chain of isolated observation posts. The primary line of defense, relatively more solid, is positioned roughly 10 kilometers behind the border to stay out of range of basic FPV drones. As a result, since March 7th, Russian reconnaissance units have managed to infiltrate several completely abandoned border villages. Due to poor coordination and ongoing shortage of artillery shells, partly a consequence of recently resolved US military aid delays, Ukrainian artillery has been unable to fully neutralize the threat. Meanwhile, the command of the 125th Brigade, despite clear signs and public knowledge that Russian attack is imminent, continues to largely ignore the situation. On May 10th, around 3 am, Russians begin their new offensive with intensive artillery and aviation bombardment of all Ukrainian positions. It inflicts the first losses on Ukrainian troops, mostly TDF and border guards infantry, holding the sparse fortifications. The Starlink terminals are also jammed, which creates extra confusion. Significantly outnumbering Ukrainians, the infantry of the 7th, 9th, and 79th, 275th, 280th Motor Rifle Regiments of the 18th Motor Rifle Division, mixed with some special operations forces, crossed the border near village of Stalemate, Krasne, Pylna, and Borisivka. Together with that, Russians launched another strike to the east, entering Uhertseve, Gatyshe, and Platenivka with forces of the 1st, 41st Motor Rifle, and 153rd Tank Regiments. The bridge across the Vovcha River to the east of sizable city of Vovchansk is destroyed with an airstrike. What's interesting is that Russians do not rush to throw everything they have into offensive, keeping a number of other motor rifle regiments, the 128th Motor Rifle, 2nd Spetsnaz Brigades, 69 and 72nd Motor Rifle Divisions in reserve. While the local command of Operational Tactical Group in Kharkiv is paralyzed by indecision, the Territorial Defense Forces and Border Guard detachments, with the support of defense intelligence operatives, inflict the first losses on the Russians. Drones, especially elite Peaky Blinders, also begin constant strikes. Despite that, the terrain with many forested areas allows Russians to covertly move relatively large groups of infantry, while their few armored vehicles suffer from drones. Nevertheless, without solid command and coordination, outnumbered Ukrainians in many positions are at risk of being surrounded, so they retreat, quickly losing 2 strips of border villages and a number of positions around them in the course of the first day of the invasion. Dissatisfied with the fact that Russian forces are not stopped on the border, Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Alexander Syrsky, the next day removes Brigadier General Yuri Galushkin, commander of the tactical grouping, Lieutenant General Artur Gorbenko, commander of the 125th Territorial Defense Brigade, and Colonel Ilya Lapin, commander of the 415th TDF Battalion, from their posts. Most importantly, Syrsky appoints the highly skilled Brigadier General Mikhailo Drapati as the new commander of the grouping and dispatches reinforcements. The 42nd Mechanized Brigade takes up positions around Liptsi, backed by one of the Ukraine's best National Guards unit, the 13th Khartia Brigade. To the east, while Russian forces apparently aim to seize the sizable city of Vovchansk, the first elements of the 57th Motorized Brigade arrive, along with small detachment from the 13th Brigade. Attempting to delay the Ukrainian redeployment, Russian forces destroy the bridge across Stary Saltiv Dam with Ha-38 missile. To suppress Ukrainian artillery, they rely on stockpile of Lancet loitering munitions, which conduct frequent strikes primarily targeting howitzers and SAM systems at higher than average intensity, making it difficult for them to support retreating Ukrainian troops. On May 12th, Russian forces continue their advance as Ukrainian troops retreat, capturing Morochovets, Oleinikova and Zelene. They reinforce their positions with so-called African Corps, a brigade-sized unit composed of expendable mercenaries from across Africa. On May 13th, Russian troops press forward and engage in heavy fighting for the village of Gleboke. At the same time, a sharp Ukrainian counterattack successfully ejects them from Zelene, despite the arrival of the elite 217th Guards Airborne Regiment. Near Vovchansk, Russian units reach the city's outskirts, posing an imminent threat of encircling the city and crossing the Vovcha River if not stopped immediately. Recognizing the critical situation, the head of the Ukrainian Defense Intelligence, Kyrylo Budanov, deploys elite special operations forces to defend the city. These include Kraken, Timura, Shaman and Vidar units, as well as Russian Volunteer Corps, which has crossed the border in this area on several prior occasions. Once again, Russian forces attempt to block the arrival of reinforcements, primarily the 57th Motorized Brigade, by destroying a key bridge in the center of Vovchansk, but the effort proves ineffective. On May 14th, while Ukrainian reinforcements are still redeploying, battles erupt for Staritsa, Buhrovatka and inside Vovchansk itself. In Liptsi area, the arrival of the 8th Special Operations Regiment and battalions from the battle-hardened 92nd Assault Brigade halts the Russian advance by May 15th. Every approach route is now under constant drone surveillance, and despite waves of Russian infantry assaults, Ukrainian defenses hold firm, methodically decimating the attackers. Russian forces gain a foothold in a small forested area, but this becomes their last tactical gain in this sector. Any attempt to leave the woods across the open terrain results in near certain death. To the east, however, Russian troops leverage the urban environment to hide from the ever-present drones and continue advancing. They capture the abandoned local hospital, turning it into temporary base. Nevertheless, the brutal resistance of the Ukrainian Special Operations Forces prevents them from reaching and crossing the Vovcha River, a key natural defensive barrier. By May 16th, Russian units managed to secure parts of the city, which endures relentless shelling by the 244th Artillery Brigade and bombing runs with OMPK glide bombs. Seeking to exploit these gains, Russia deploys the 11th Tank Regiment, 2 additional motor rifle regiments and elements of the 69th Motor Rifle Division and 25th Motor Rifle Brigade to Vovchansk. In response, Ukraine moves the 253rd Assault Battalion of the 128th TDF Brigade, the 2nd Battalion of the 36th Marine Brigade, and the elite Stugna Special Operations Battalion, while beginning the redeployment of the 71st Yager Brigade to the area. Ukrainian aviation begins conducting precise airstrikes on buildings occupied by Russian forces, using far fewer munitions, but with much higher accuracy thanks to American JDAMs, GBU-39s, and French HIMARS bombs. One such strike annihilates the hospital, burying dozens of Russian assault troops. During a similar bombing run on May 17th, Ukraine loses a Su-27 fighter jet. The pilot, Denis Vasilyuk, does not survive, likely shot down by a Russian fighter using R-37M long-range air-to-air missile. The Liptsy area remains under relentless shelling and bombing, but Russian infantry groups that manage to infiltrate the town are methodically destroyed by the well-entrenched forces of the 13th National Guard Brigade and the 92nd Assault Brigade. As Russia brings in more artillery, including the 29th Artillery Regiment, it continues to pound Vovchansk. However, their infantry remains bogged down in intense urban combat there, managing only limited advances to the east and west, where they capture mostly empty forest areas by May 20th. As of now, Russian forces control only a small northern fraction of Vovchansk, above the river that splits the city in two. The initial Ukrainian defenders of Vovchansk, despite being outnumbered, succeeded in tying down Russian troops long enough for elements of the 57th Motorized Brigade to take up defensive positions inside the city. Meanwhile, the 82nd Air Assault, 36th Marine and 71st Yager Brigades arrive on the southern bank of the Vovcha River in full force. Ukrainian artillery, though still under pressure from Lancet strikes, begins receiving more ammunition, significantly boosting its effectiveness. On May 21st, Russian forces shift their focus eastward, attacking in the direction of open terrain without settlements. The Belarusian volunteer unit, Terror Battalion, reportedly defending the village of Tikhe, continues to hold the line. Ukraine also establishes multiple small river crossings to continue reinforcing Vovchansk. In response, Russia's attempt to hunt these using helicopter-launched Lemur missiles, since the precision of OMPK glide bombs proves insufficient for such small objectives. These Lemur strikes are relatively rare, as most of the Russian helicopters still rely on unguided rocket salvos, fired in pitch-up attacks, widely seen as inaccurate. In a notable development, Ukrainian forces begin targeting these helicopters using FPV drones, marking the early stages of a new air defense tactic. Overall, Russia increases its use of high-precision weapons such as Lancet drones, Lemur missiles, and Krasnopol shells to compensate for the reduced presence of armored vehicles on this front and to provide minimal cover for the infantry groups. However, as even modest tactical gains stall, Russian casualties mount. Ukrainian drone units maintain complete control over the battlefield, constantly destroying exposed targets across the both salients, which in most places are less than 10 kilometers deep. This dominance prevents effective resupply, medical evacuation, and troop rotations, resulting in skyrocketing Russian losses. In Vovchansk, the newly arrived Lyud Brigade, formed out of former police members who specialize in urban combat, enters the northern part of the city with the support of the Terror Battalion. At this point, the ruins of Vovchansk, with constant skirmishes for every building, start reminding urban combat in Bakhmut in their intensity. The only difference is that drones push significant losses for both sides even higher. This is especially true for armored vehicles because once the Russians try to advance to Vovchansk with tanks or BMPs, these are destroyed right near the border, not reaching even close to the city. Sometimes their MTLBs still infiltrate the ruins, but usually do not live long. As of May 25th, the front line has not changed much, signifying the end of the active phase of the Russian cross-border attack. After 2 weeks of Victory Day offensive, the Russian goals in the Kharkiv region and their progress on them are quite clear. The grouping of forces north had to divert and tie down in combat Ukrainian reserves from primary direction of advance, the Donetsk region. While doing that, Russians likely wanted to establish a mentioned by Putin buffer zone that has to be at least 15 to 20 kilometers wide to push back Ukrainian artillery and troops from the border. Simultaneously, such an advance would allow Russian artillery to reach Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine. Instead, the sizable Russian grouping of forces north was essentially stopped at its heels after advancing between 5 and 8 kilometers from the border. With hindsight, we can see that Ukrainians did not use up any key reserves that were carefully gathered for the Kursk offensive 3 months later, except for 82nd Air Assault Brigade. the Russian advance towards key towns in the Donetsk region, Pokrovsk, Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, did not pick up pace after May 10th, gaining an extra few kilometers at most. Essentially, Russians have managed to take a few border villages and a fraction of totally flattened Vovchansk in exchange for thousands of men and no real strategic benefit. Due to heavy use of civilian vans, golf carts, motorcycles and other unprotected vehicles, the Russian losses during medical evacuations and rotations may surpass those in direct combat due to constant work of Ukrainian FPVs. Stationary positions are also in danger as Ukrainians are actively using heavy bomber hexacopters called Baba Yaga to drop huge munitions day and night on them. Another unlikely possibility is that Russians actually plan to make an attack on Liptsi as a diversion while quickly capturing Vovchansk and having the Donetsk River covering their flank, strike the city of Kupiansk from the rear to eventually push Ukrainians behind Oskil River. This might be partially supported by the fact that Russians captured Ivanivka around May 25th and destroyed one of the Ukrainian river crossings across Oskil, but this is about all they can do to worsen Ukrainian positions in the eastern Kharkiv region. By the end of the month, Ukrainians also bring the full 36th Marine Brigade to the area, as well as yet another special operations unit under Gur, 8th Battalion Aratta. Russians also destroy one of the key Vovchansk bridges with glide bombs, but Ukrainians continue to defend the city with mostly infantry, as the ruins of Vovchansk hardly require a lot of armored vehicles, so small makeshift bridges are still sufficient for logistics, which also heavily relies on drones at this moment. The farthest point where Russians take temporary foothold is the Vovchansk aggregate plant. The irregular groups of infantry were occasionally spotted there since May 20th, but were usually destroyed, trying to accumulate for further breakthrough across the river. Since then, some industrial buildings were changing hands daily, but since Russians were often targeted by drones before they reached the cover of the factory plant, Ukrainians mostly repelled attacks here. Around June 1st, Ukrainian infantry in buildings, specifically from the Tsunami Regiment of the Elite Brigade, the Russian Volunteer Corps and the 9th Rifle Battalion, keep all key routes through which the adversary can get to Vovchansk aggregate plant under fire control. At this point, the Russians switched to using drones to bring supplies to those few who got to the factory plant. We mentioned a few times that Russians almost do not use heavy armor due to severe shortages and the destruction of majority of vehicles on the border. The exception happens on June 2nd, when a small Russian column reaches the outskirts of Staritsa, which is defended by the 42nd Mechanized Brigade and the 2nd Battalion of the 101st Guards Brigade of the General Staff. The composition of Russian assault force, specifically two 60s era T-62s and one BMP-2, shows real well how the war changed, as in 2022, columns composed of dozens of new T-80 BVMs and T-72 B3s rolled through the border a few kilometers from here. Now, even these three Russian vehicles are quickly spotted by reconnaissance drones of the 42nd Mechanized Brigade. In a few minutes, multiple Ukrainian FPVs approach vehicles from the rear and sides to destroy them one by one, ending yet another armored assault, which progressively become rarer, especially in the northern Kharkiv region. Ukraine finally receives long-awaited permission to use HIMARS systems against targets on the Russian territory bordering the Kharkiv region. On June 2nd, Ukrainian forces launch HIMARS strike that destroys a state-of-art Russian S-400 long-range surface-to-air missile system in Belgorod region. A total of 7 vehicles sustain various degrees of damage, including the radar and 2 launchers. This significantly reduces the threat to Ukrainian aircraft in the area, allowing them to carry out more strikes with reduced risk, at least for time being. Elements of the Ukrainian 92nd Brigade around June 5th conduct assaults on Hleboke, but these are unsuccessful as the village ruins partially remain in adversaries' hands. This is mostly due to how quickly Russians build fortifications, without hesitation using unarmored engineering equipment right in the reach of the Ukrainian drones. While costly in manpower, this tactic has proven to be notably effective. On June 6th, Ukrainian HIMARS systems once again target the Belgorod region, destroying the command post of the 6th Combined Arms Army near Shebekine. 8 Russian officers went missing after the strike. On June 13th, Russians again attacked with Ha-38 missile the river crossing on Starый Saltiv Dam. As Ukrainians have already redeployed all the forces they wanted from the eastern part of the region to the border, it's questionable how the strike would help. However, if it shows something, it is that the average river crossing are not easy to destroy, and they can be rebuilt quite quickly, and this is the reason why the northern part of Vovchansk did not fall after Russians bombed each and every bridge across the Vovcha River. In the first half of June, the Russian command also desperately tries to revive the offensive. The staggering losses of a month of relentless assaults, especially inside Vovchansk, significantly reduced the grouping, so the 83rd Air Assault and 155th Naval Infantry Brigades, as well as the 45th High-Power Artillery Brigade, with a few extra regiments, are redeployed here. Ukrainians once again reinforced positions with the 3rd and 5th National Guard Brigades, as well as few drone units, including 414th UAV Battalion, Birds of Magyar, Achilles and Horn Group, arguably one of the strongest units of this kind in Ukrainian military. Grueling combat in Vovchansk, ongoing for over a month, results in extremely high Russian losses. Ukrainians holding the advantage of high-rise buildings and more drones effectively trap Russian forces in the city and decimate them by hundreds. A particularly desperate situation unfolds at Vovchansk aggregate factory. Russian forces, by moving in primarily small infantry groups, accumulate a few hundred soldiers of the 83rd Air Assault Brigade there, relying mostly on drone supply. It remains unclear what their objective is, as they are unable to cross the river under relentless Ukrainian drone pressure. Nevertheless, the Russian command doubles down, deploying more VTV forces, even though most routes to the factory, especially through the single park, are controlled by Ukrainians. As a result, the Russian garrison finds itself trapped. Ukrainians choose not to rush an assault, instead maintaining solid control over parts of the factory complex and the adjacent districts. On June 15th, Colonel Yevgeny Okhrimenko, commander of the 69th Motor Rifle Division, is killed in the Kharkiv region, likely in yet another HIMARS strike on command post. Around June 16th, Russians lose several positions near Gliboke, though control over the ruined village remains contested, with neither side achieving full dominance. By June 20th, they also lose positions in Vovchansk adjacent to the river, but manage a minor advance eastward. Overall, the situation remains precariously balanced, if the term balance can even apply to the most brutal urban combat since Bakhmut. Both Ukrainian and Russian aviation continue to launch airstrikes, demonstrating roughly comparable overall effectiveness. Russians continue to employ a higher volume of bombs with significantly lower precision, while Ukrainians rely on fewer but much more accurate munitions. Ukrainian forces also persist in launching GMLRS rockets from HIMARS systems, which the Russians now attempt to eliminate using high-value Iskander ballistic missiles, an act that further underscores the perceived threat and effectiveness of HIMARS in this theater. On June 22nd, Russians begin a new wave of deliberate attacks on civil infrastructure in Kharkiv using OMPK glide bombs. For the close-range targets like Liptsi, they start deploying modified FAB 3000 bombs with gliding kits. However, due to their massive size and limited accuracy, the effectiveness of these weapons remains questionable, particularly in the contrast to the precision-guided munitions employed by Ukrainian forces. By the end of March, Ukrainians had significantly improved their positions in Vovchansk, continuing to lock down the Russian garrison in the aggregate factory plant. Constant counterattacks are coupled with a huge number of drone strikes on everything, ranging from separate infantrymen to artillery behind the enemy lines. Russian Spetsnaz operatives of the 2nd Spetsnaz Brigade are spotted in the city, trying to create a breakthrough to the factory, but to no avail. The Russian command also attempts to send more armored vehicles to Gliboke to revitalize the offensive against Liptsi that bogged down in the first weeks of attacks. However, since at least June 5th, Achilles and Birds of Magyar drone units conduct not only strike UAV missions, but also actively use drones to mine the roads as far as Krasne, so the few vehicles reach positions. The Ukrainian forces on July 7th launch an attack reaching the northern part of the Gliboke after a flank maneuver. They take foothold there for weeks, but under constant bombardments and artillery strikes in the village that practically no longer exists, they eventually roll back to heavily fortified Liptsi. All this time, in Vovchansk, the heavy urban combat for every house persists without major territorial shifts, so Ukrainians maintain control over the portion of the city to the north of the river and continue constant drone strikes on the Russian garrison in a few factory plants buildings. In mid-July, Russians conduct a number of Iskander ballistic missile strikes on the railroad infrastructure and training grounds of Ukrainian forces in the Kharkiv region. As devastating as these strikes are, the fact that they are sporadic, unlike Ukrainian consistent HIMARS missile strikes, significantly diminishes their overall effect on the strategic situation in the region. At the beginning of August, Ukrainians launched the Kursk incursion, which, unlike the Russian Victory Day offensive, used the element of surprise to cut right through Russian defensive lines and capture dozens of Russian villages, attracting a significant portion of available Russian reserves. and the best drone units. Using way fewer forces in the first week, Ukrainians secure many times more land, capture more prisoners, and destroy more Russian equipment than the Russians did in 3 months of grueling combat in the Kharkiv region. Since the grouping of forces north is now busy trying to stop the Ukrainian attack in Kursk region, the Kharkiv offensive quickly falls down in the list of priorities. However, not for Ukrainians. The Defense Intelligence of Ukraine plans to finish off the garrison of the Vovchansk aggregate factory plant to remove any possibility that the Russian forces can infiltrate across the river. For this, throughout July, the factory is heavily bombed by Ukrainian aviation and targeted by FPVs and heavy bomber drones from the 82nd Air Assault and 57th Motorized Brigades. The Horn Group unit also sends the land drones that deliver up to 200 kilograms of explosives and destroy key positions. After that, around September 17th, a week-long operation starts with units Stugna, Paragon, RVC, Junger, BVC, Terror, all under the unified command of Defense Intelligence and likely Kirill Budanov himself, storming the factory plant from all directions. The battle is extremely brutal, and the Russians, especially elements of the VDV, 45th and 2nd Spetsnaz brigades, were sitting inside of the factory for months and had well-prepared positions. Nevertheless, in heavy door-to-door assaults, Ukrainian Special Operations Forces clear all 30 buildings, taking the remains of the garrison as prisoners. After this small but important success, the further combat in Vovchansk continues at a distance from Vovcha River that, due to immense efforts of Ukrainians, became a barrier that Russians were unable to cross. Near Liptsi, on October 16th, Ukrainians' defense intelligence units Artan, Kraken, International and Freedom of Russia legions conduct another smaller counterattack, pushing Russians out of the few positions in the forests. The operation is successful, but on the grand scale of things, the situation remains pretty much the same. As it turned out, this was just reconnaissance before the 13th National Guard Brigade, with the support of artillery of the 92nd Assault Brigade, launches its own tactical offensive in November. The brigade command decides to soften up enemy positions with purely unmanned weapon systems, employing a variety of land drones for mining, fire suppression and jamming. This is likely the first operation of this scale executed solely by unmanned systems. After that, Ukrainians begin the traditional assaults, moving BMP-2s, Spartan APCs and M113s from their hideouts in Liptsi and quickly approaching the forest. Due to proper timing and jamming, no vehicles were targeted by Russian FPVs. After that, the infantry disembarks and under the support of armor starts clearing the forest. The Russian infantry begins a counterattack, entering brutal combat with Ukrainian soldiers, but it is quickly stopped as multiple bomber drones precisely strike assault troops. With the support of artillery, mortars, MLRS, Ukrainians take a foothold in the forest and organize resupplies and medical evacuation. The battle for the forest will persist throughout the next 6 months, ending with Ukrainians taking it fully under control. Coming back to December 2024, in Vovchansk, positions remain mostly the same, even though daily assaults continue. Same as near Liptsi, here, many Ukrainian land forces brigades are withdrawn, leaving mostly infantry units of border guards and the defense intelligence operatives to hold the key positions. This way, the Kharkiv direction once again becomes the area that is secured by Ukrainians, but does not tie down large reserves as the Russians originally wanted. This fact, coupled with Russian inability to advance past Gleboka to reach Kharkiv with a regular artillery and establish a buffer zone, made the whole Victory Day offensive a significant misstep. Despite issues with manpower and command and control that haunted Ukraine throughout 2024, the Russian new Kharkiv offensive showed that the Ukrainian armed forces are nowhere near the brink of collapse. Mikhailo Drapati's competent actions, as well as the Ukrainian quite numerous special operations forces of the defense intelligence, were enough to stop Russian Victory Day offensive. Further battles rendered Russian grouping of forces north competent and effective, which was often highlighted not just by Ukrainians, but even by Russians. The participants of the offensives themselves, from the Russian side, noted extremely harsh conditions which the command created, continuing the practice of extremely costly tactic of using disposable troops in the form of small infantry groups. It's not a surprise taking into account that the whole Victory Day offensive was to a great extent planned and executed by Colonel General Alexander Lapin. For him, this operation is not the first disaster, as Lapin is notorious for total lack of competence and ability to learn from mistakes, mixed with remarkable resilience inside the Russian military hierarchy. The confirmed by photographic evidence losses in vehicles of the grouping reached at least 165 pieces of various equipment, as well as many hundreds more of civilian vehicles and golf carts, which were also used in assaults in mass. These are the numbers for the main period when Russians still had some hopes to improve their positions near Kharkiv from May 10th to August 26th. What's interesting is that approximately 1/3 of these vehicles were actually destroyed in the Belgorod region before even reaching the border with Ukraine. At the same time, Ukrainians lost 83 pieces of equipment, half of what Russians did. Even though this disparity is staggering, in the previous videos we have seen that Russians were easily losing 3 and 4 times more equipment in certain battles in Donbas. But the Victory Day offensive in particular was probably the first one where the use of armored vehicles was deliberately minimized. This is likely due to a combination of factors, but undeniably the slowly approaching deficit of equipment, as well as the fact that Russians did not have to advance farther than 7 kilometers, played a key role in that. Even as of August 2024, the overall idea to tie down Ukrainian forces in the Kharkiv region was not successful. Russians indeed intensified attacks towards Pokrovsk, Donetsk and Chasiv Yar after launching their Kharkiv offensive, but their progress in all these areas was on average less than 5 kilometers. Only near Pokrovsk, their maximum advance was 25 kilometers, which created a 20-kilometer wide salient towards the city, and the price of this advance was still enormous. Therefore, as a feint, the Victory Day offensive never brought the intended results. Moreover, during these events, Ukrainians not only managed to accumulate reserves for the Kursk offensive, but also to some extent used the northern front as a successful feint. For example, across the Kharkiv region, they used audio equipment at night to simulate the movement of large armored formations, aiming to mislead the enemy into believing that reserves were being redeployed not to Sumy, but to Kharkiv. This deception was reinforced by the large number of high-quality decoys, which not only attracted Russian drones, but also convincingly suggested that the next major offensive would take place in Kharkiv rather than in Kursk. In conclusion, the Russian 2024 Kharkiv offensive clearly failed to achieve its objectives and, on strategic level, proved to be miscalculated diversion, one that Ukraine swiftly countered, minimizing any long-term impact.